Hello my friends, welcome back to another episode of Radical Radio Scotland. So I set up a YouTube channel in 2021, right, which is cringy I know, and I started posting video essays about issues that we were facing in Scotland on it. See, on my first video, I got a comment that went straight to my heart. This guy called Angus MacDonald, which is the most Scottish name I've ever heard by the way, he commented saying, listening to something so well written and in a voice that sounds like mine is refreshing. See, out of all the comments I've ever had about anything that I've ever done, that has stuck with me the most. It made me think about how rare it is to hear Scottish voices in the mainstream media talking about issues that affect people's everyday lives. It's also a comment that made me start this podcast, because I just don't want my voice to be heard in the form of video essays. I want everyone who is working to make this part of the world a better place to be heard. So this project is all about building a library of resistance, a place where you can come and hear the voices and the stories of those involved in trying to improve the lives of our fellow humans. I also think that it's important that this podcast is a place where you can come and concentrate on these conversations and all these stories without being sold to by private companies. That's why I'm keeping this podcast ad-free. No company is going to pay me to run ads before, during or after these conversations. But with that said, obviously a lot of work does go into running this, so if you do want to support us, then please do check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Radical Radio Scotland. But listen, with all of that said, on to today's chat. Wow, what a superb conversation I have for all of you today. Keith Millar is an absolute legend. This man became involved with the anarchist movements of the 1970s. And today, in 2022, he's still trying to make the world a better place. It was an absolute delight to listen to him talk about everything he's been involved with for the last half a century. Some of the stories in here are mental, as Keith obviously comes from a different world than the one we live in. But yeah, forgetting all that, let's just go into the podcast. Everybody, please put your hands together for Keith Millar. So, Keith, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me today and taking time out of your busy schedule. I know that you've got a concert and branch meetings with the IWW and so on, so thank you. You've obviously been interested in anarchism for a long time. So, like, how and when did you become interested in anarchism? Like, how did that kind of kickstart for you?
Yeah, I've never been an anarchist ideologue, so basically my interest didn't really come from the study of Kropotkin or Bakunin and all these people. Basically, it was like catch up to what happened in the late 60s, and I was studying sociology and politics at Strathclyde, and came across sort of new left sort of theories and things, and sort of new concepts like contestation and self-management, and so it wasn't really from an ideological thing at all. It was about a challenge to the new society. I mean, the trouble is, by the time I was involved in things, a lot of that initial upsurge in the 60s had dissipated or changed into different forms. So it wasn't really around. A lot of the people that were around at that time had kind of left into politics. So when I got involved in a Glasgow Anarchist Group, which actually started in a squat in Butte Gardens,
so that's Glasgow Squatters Union.
No, that was slightly later. That was a organic growth from that.
Okay.
Most of the people that crystallized around that time were all kind of relatively new. But we did have some contacts with the past, and there's some legendary figures who, to be fair to them, they did kind of remain on the periphery of the group, which has allowed us to get our own group together, which is maybe something I should bear in mind for myself today, But people like Bobby Lynn, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he was a quite a unique character. He'd been involved in the Clydeside apprentices strike, and he was involved in various industries, but he was also a street hawker, and he combined the theories of Max Stirner and syndicalism, and he called himself a conscious egoist. And he was involved in all sorts of illegal activities as well, such as running a shebeen, an illegal bar. And to be honest, after his death, we also found out he did a bit of housebreaking. So yeah, that's the kind of characters you would come across. And they're also the kind of characters that Stuart Christie came across earlier in the mid to late 60s when he emerged in Glasgow. So some of these characters like him and Farquhar MacLay and whatever were still about. And you had others who were emerging from Trotskyism, who like Brian Biggins, who used to run a newsagent. I think the name might even still be there in Oswald Street. Anyway, these are all sorts of characters around, but one thing to bear in mind, present day listeners, is the mentality of people were quite different. Now you've got to take into account, we were quite different from the people that preceded us, and that we were aware of feminism and stuff, which, not to say we were all completely sussed in that direction, because it was all pretty new, but we were at least aware of it, whereas a lot of the earlier generations espoused a philosophy, I can do what I want, and that didn't always involve respect for other people. So it was we always had this generation clash, and I can see it today too, because you've got the emergence of new things and we would never have dreamed of in terms of gender choice and things. And it's important to not transpose the present onto the past, to try and understand where people are coming from. We're all kind of flawed characters to some degree. None of us have finished article because we're living in a flawed society, So that's all from the personal angle I've kind of deviated onto, digressed onto. But the other thing is the context of the time. You've got in the early 70s, Ted Heath unexpectedly won the election and tried to introduce an agenda that was kind of pre-Thatcher. The unions were still strong, and that was they kind of largely won over, and Labour won the election. So when we were forming a Glasgow Anarchist Group in 75, Labour was back in power, but the people didn't have the illusions in them they had in the 60s, because they'd been through all the disappointments in place of strife and everything else. So we were certainly not abashed, sort of exposing Labour and the kind of left dependence on putting Labour in power. Of course, at the end of the period, 79, Thatcher got elected, but I don't think that's anything to do with us. That was they certainly exploited the Labour's problems with winter discontent and stuff. So anyway, the Glasgow Anarchist Group in the mid-70s, it crystallised, as I said, into a group of people, and what we did most successfully, apart from, we did grow into a reasonable sized group. We did meet initially in a squat, which it was a very large lounge area. It was, you could have 50 people in there quite easily, but we did also hold public meetings, and we're at a fortunate time a lot of people, legendary figures, were still around. So we had, for example, Jod Oldie up from London, who tried to blow up Hitler because he came from Germany originally. We had in one meeting Albert Meltzer and Miguel Garcia Miguel from the CNT. That was in a debate with the IMG on Spanish anarchism. But they brought in some guy from the Basque Country who nevertheless travelled up with Miguel and Albert. We never actually put on a meeting with Christie, but he did appear a couple of times. But at that time, he was up north there or something, And then we did have a number of community campaigns. We were quite influenced by what was going on in Italy at the time. There was this thing called, which was loosely translated as Take Over the City. And that meant to various direct actions and campaigns around challenging the need, the need, why isn't bus travel free or things like that, So we had a thing called the Fair Fares campaign. Some direct action, but mostly involved going out in the middle of the night in a van and fly posting peripheral schemes right from Easter House to Drum Chapel, wherever, So that was quite a learning curve for us, But I mean, some of these groups kind of run out of steam after 3 or 4 years, and that's what happened with that group, So there was a kind of, what's the word? Slight gap between them and the emergence of a new group called the Clydeside Anarchists in the early 80s. So although it contained some of the same people, there was also some new people that came around, many of whom had dropped out of Trotskyism, from the SWP militant. And, they were people that brought a new kind of energy and purpose to the group, So some, at least one of them I'm still working with today.
Yeah.
So I don't know where we are with the questions, but that's like when you got first interested, I suppose. What we did as well is we set up this thing called the Scottish Libertarian Federation. Because the word libertarian really wasn't associated with right-wing ideas at the time, And we we linked with groups that existed in Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen, Stirling, and we went and actually set up a meeting in Stirling, and that the council was so upset by this they cancelled the venue, because they've seen all these posters all around the town. They thought there was some mini invasion going on, So we actually ended up having a public meeting in a pub, just down the road from where the meeting was scheduled. But these are the kind of things we did. So that was that. And then, another thing we did, some of us did, was involved in the Claimants Union. So I know this is quite a long period just for the 70s, but these were all great learning curves for us, because the Claimants Union wasn't just composed of a bunch of politicos and anarchists and things. It was people joined it in various estates, who didn't really have much grasp of politics at all. They were just kind of annoyed with the benefit system and things like that, So the groups suddenly sprung up in all sorts of places. We went to a meeting once in Blackhill, walking through drifted snow to get there, and found out we were the only group that bothered to attend. That was the West End Claimants Union at the time.
Yeah.
But we found a generosity from people in all these areas. It was good. It was sort of. So that was a learning curve, and we did actually go to a big national conference. We got hired a bus. We got money from the Strathclyde Regional Council by occupying a meeting, and they agreed to sign a cheque just to get rid of us. And we got this bus and we went down to London, about 20 odd. And it's a long story. Someday I'm going to write up the proper short story, because one of the people actually from Blackhill actually died on the way down.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really know a lot of the people, obviously, what their medical health history were and stuff. And we were actually, as we went into England, the temperature actually plummeted. Strangely enough, it was actually warm in Scotland, and the bus was not very well. And I mean, he was okay, because they kept on having regular breaks at service stations and things. This was in the middle of the night when people wanting some shut-eye. Well, I certainly was wanting some shut-eye. We had a conference the next day, but they weren't thinking like that, Anyway, so when we all piled off the bus in the morning, including a guy in a wheelchair who was slightly off his trolley by then, I went careering down Islington High Street or something. We found there was somebody motionless in the bus. So you can imagine the kind of So that is a huge digression, but nevertheless, it's a kind of does situate things, you know.
Yeah.
So we were quite different from a lot of the other attendees at the conference. I don't think they knew what to make of such a large delegation that suddenly appeared, and you know, they didn't really have proper sleeping accommodation for us at all, you know, and it was perishing, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's maybe that's a story in itself.
Yeah. So it sounds like anarchism used to be quite, well, not just anarchism, but like that whole kind of movement used to be quite popular in Scotland. Obviously, you were talking about there being squats and stuff like that. You don't really find much squats in Glasgow anymore, I find, other than the one that happened during COP26. But I feel that was, I don't know really what to make
I think
of
the
it.
thing with squats is that, you know, unlike England where it was a civil offence, it was a criminal offence here, so it was much more difficult to engage in squatting. All the squats we opened were in university properties, so they were just less bothered about, one of them, in fact, all they really wanted was all these bottles that belonged to the Department of Urology to be excavated. And they got annoyed too when we started painting the door. We meant to paint it red and black, but we only got the red part up, you know. So, yeah, what we did, we tried to link with people who were in squats around the city, but what we found was a lot of them were in a kind of abandoned properties where individual owners and things had just stopped charging rent and things, or so they were effectively squatting, but there was no politics behind it at all, you know. And even in the Butte Gardens, there was a second squat just literally 2 yards, 10 yards down the road, and they were all just full of opportunists, you know. There was a guy with a sports car parked outside that one. So, it was difficult. We did try and engage with people, and recently actually I was at a concert and some guy approached me and said, listen, I met you like 45 years ago or something. Turns out he was one of the people that had opened a squat in Curzon Street, and he remembered people from that area coming along to help him, you know, and it's quite amazing that he remembered, because I had no idea who he was, you know.
Yeah.
You know, and how he managed to recognise me as well, you know, given I had a beard and stuff at the time.
Yeah.
There you go. So squatting, it was quite short-lived, really. It didn't really work in the long term. A lot of these things had contradictions. The Claimants Union, there ended up being a bit of a split between the people who were non-political, who wanted to become part of the welfare rights industry, or sort of be in good terms with the local social work department, and the more political people involved. So we did find there was a lot of empathy with example, Castle Milk Claimants Union, who were quite political, but a lot of the other ones just down the road in Rutherglen and other places, they didn't really have this political consciousness that that we had. So before long, it all kind of disappeared. And to be honest, too, some of us just had to get jobs by then, and we ended up finding jobs in that welfare rights industry.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's sometimes happens, but we have to live, so we didn't. Everybody's pressured at every time of life to get a job, so sometimes that was a good thing, because at least you were assisting people.
Yeah. So could you tell us a bit about the Radical Bookshop Collective from the late 70s?
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, there was like a first attempt to set up a collective, but the real one that crystallised, the Glasgow Bookshop Collective, was more like early 80s. I don't know exactly the precise time, probably the end of 81 through to the end of 84, when we basically the renting rates combined was too great, even though there was nobody working, there was no wage, there was all just one large collective of about 30 people, most of whom volunteered in some capacity to do a stint. But well, yeah, it was quite a dynamic time, because it brought together a lot of people who were anarchists, but just generally were kind of not in parties either or anything. So it was a good experience. a smaller collective changes formed out of that, which kept things going for a few years in West Princes Street. But the economics of a large bookshop space in Great Western Road, just corner Belmont Street, was difficult to sustain. We also had a printing press in our basement at one stage too. So anyway, it was an interesting experience again. And also, I suppose the Glasgow Bookshop Collective too was more gender friendly because there were more women involved, So it was like, whereas a lot of political groups tend to have a skew, male dominance thing,
Yeah, I can imagine, especially in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, there was a small anarchist feminist group in Glasgow for a while, but I don't think it was terribly long. People tend to drift into the women's movement rather than create separate.
Yeah. So you were saying that there was a Clydeside group as well set up? Was
Clydeside, yeah, just became a name rather than adopt the same name Glasgow, partly because a lot of the instigators kept coming from outside Glasgow. Paisley, East Kilbride, places like that. So it's made sense to go back to the name Clydeside, Red Clydesiders. I've just realised before I go into that, though, I didn't mention the Glasgow People's Press.
Okay.
Because we ran a community newspaper for 11 issues. So that's possibly it was okay. I mean, I don't think it was a great success. Again, it's part of a learning curve. But it was a way of reaching out to all sorts of communities. And it was actually produced in Postle Park. That's where we got together in the community flat. And so it was part of the reaching out to communities experience.
So it was what, 11 issues of a newspaper that went out?
Yeah, I mean, there was an element of naivety about some of it, but I suppose, as I say, put it down to experience. And I mean, some people dropped out too. Maybe it ended up with just one or two people doing it. It maybe ran out of steam. There had been a much more successful independent newspaper before that called the Glasgow News, which had existed for quite a longer. That was up to about just 74 only. That was like maybe the whole of the early 70s, maybe from the late 60s. But a lot of them one of them went into conventional journalism, Ron Mackay, another one went down south and ended up being a psychotherapist or something. So anyway, come the early 80s, the journalist approach was part of the Clydeside Anarchist Group because they set up Practical Anarchy as a news sheet, newspaper, free newspaper. Without that, there wouldn't have been much identity to the group. So we produced maybe thousands of copies, and distributed them. I don't know what the print run was, but I suspect it might have gone up to 10,000 even at one stage, or for one issue, depending on if there's big demonstrations and things. We didn't always make ourselves popular amongst the kind of left who turned up. One who turned up wearing Michael Foot and Tony Benn masks, and some people got irate and tried to rip him off us. And we also, one issue was called Fuck the Falklands, because the Falklands War had broken out, and we were just, so we came up with that slogan, and that led to a bit of problems with the police as well.
Really?
Yeah. Well, the thing with it, you couldn't use the word fuck just quite as much as you do now. It certainly wouldn't be anywhere near television or anything the way it is today, or radio. So yeah, all these issues sprung up, and Practical Anarchy was really dynamic. I don't know how many issues were produced off the top of my head, but it also led to a few local initiatives too, in Paisley, East Kilbride, Springburn, West End. People just brought out a little fanzine, maybe just on A4, whereas Practical Anarchy would tend to be on an unusual paper size. It wasn't always A3. It seemed to be like B2, B3 or something, you know.
Yeah. So just going back to talking about the kind of the police attitudes towards you swearing, but also was that toward, do you think they took that kind of stance against you because you were criticising the Falklands War as well? What was the kind of,
sometimes it's a steward, and you've got to remember at that time the Communist Party was really strong and the Labour Party, and I just didn't like these troublemakers who turn up and be quite irreverent, you know.
Yeah.
There was another one too where it wasn't the actual Clydeside Anarchists who did it, it was a kind of offshoot, that produced this thing called By the ISIL Liberation Front, which was basically a leaflet on hard toilet paper, and you just pulled down the sheet, and it was all on a Banda machine. It was very creative, you know. The messages weren't exactly the same, and you know, these things were often just totally misunderstood by the quite stuffy left at the time, you know.
Yeah. And was there quite a lot of leftist opposition to the Falklands War in that time? Because like I'm only 25, so I don't really know much about.
And obviously you had all the various drop groups and CP and stuff, and they would all be anti-militarist, the CND and stuff, so still strong from the 60s, and probably wings of the Labour Party and the SNP would be against it as well. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't remember all the ins and outs of it, but I think we only focused on it in one issue, so
yeah,
I can't remember. We would switch the emphasis to something else. You know, we tried to reproduce Practical Anarchy in a kind of daily record type format, so that people could look at it and not work out it was some sort of weird news sheet. It was actually something that was accessible, written in the same style, you know, a normal piece of newspaper. You know? So that again was largely down to, you know, an individual who had these skills and also did the printing.
So what was the Clydeside Journal about?
Clydeside Journal?
Clydeside, is it the Anarchy Journal? Clydeside Anarchy Journal?
Well, that's a time when I suppose some people like me were thinking that there was a kind of anti-intellectualism in the group, and there was a need to augment the Practical Anarchy with a kind of journal that discussed ideas. You know, we'd had that in the SLF, you know, previously when we had the newsletter there, and we'd had a way back to the squatting era. We had a thing called Anarchist Alternatives Against Authority, which was a one-off thing. So there was a bit of history there in producing, you know, magazines, a little magazine about ideas rather than just activities and action. So we did that for a couple of issues, but that kind of went into Here and Now, which is a magazine that ran for 18 issues. And I've actually got various things down here. Here and Now was initially just produced in Scotland, the West of Scotland, but then came to be a joint production with the West Yorkshire Discussion Group and a group called Pleasure Tendency that went into them, and they produced every alternative issues, and it ran out of steam by 1997. The other thing that emerged, because we were coming into the miners' strike around about 84. So in terms of longevity, one of the most longevity projects was Counter-Information, which was produced between people in Edinburgh, parts of central Scotland and Glasgow between 1984 and 2002. Eventually, I think the internet killed the likes of news sheets like that, because, you know, people get more instant news. Our news was going to be outdated. It was only coming out once every month or so, and I think we maybe got slightly exhausted too, but it was nevertheless that was a major collaboration, and it was good. It wasn't a Glasgow combined thing as well, but these were collectives that were quite outside the the anarchist group. In fact, a lot of the people in the anarchist group, especially towards here and now, were fairly antagonistic. It wasn't their style of writing or anything.
And what was the Ibrox Cessnick APT?
Well, that was the anti-poll tax, of course.
All right, okay.
Again, we're moving on from the miners' strike. The poll tax emerged, and so basically initially you had people campaign against registration, but the group in Ibrox Cessnock was just one of many groups around Glasgow. But obviously, I had an involvement in that one, and I was kind of Noah's Ark of lefties. It was set up by a woman who used to run the WRP bookshop in Hope Street, which is now a cafe towards the top of Hope Street, Hillary, and she was quite good actually. She did make people welcome, and there was people in Socialist Organiser and the two different wings of the CP. I say that deliberately because one of the guys, Ken Caird, who's now dead, he was much more on my wavelength than the other, his fellow member of the CP, there's no doubt about it. He even composed a song, because he's a bit of a folk singer, about registration officers coming to flats and disappearing. So that went down like a ton of bricks with some people, but other people felt it really amusing.
Yeah.
So it was great. But all of these local groups are good. But the trouble was, of course, the movement as a whole was dominated by militant, and the tentacles of militant were a bit like the tentacles of the CP in the past. They like to control things. Another places too, like Govan Hill, the anti-poll tax movement never really emerged properly because of rival groups fighting it out for dominance. Fortunately, in our situation, there was only like one of each kind of thing, and we had to collaborate. Also, we're in an era which was not known for left-wing agitation, but we would do a weekly street stall, and we did it every week. Now, even when there was orange marches going past. Yeah. The only exception was the apprentices strike. Some sort of youth orange thing, which was really horrible, So we found out when they were held, the things that were just so tanked up, it was too dangerous. So for that 1 week alone, we gave them a body swerve because we went on for about 5 years. But eventually, I think when it came to share of officers things, you got to remember most people were working. So they didn't have time to take off their work to be sheriff officers. So at the end of the anti-poll tax thing in the early 90s, it was a kind of rent-a-mob, rather than local groups.
Yeah.
Some of the independent groups had got together and formed a kind of independent network, and we produced a journal, which is actually the here on this T-shirt, Refuse and Resist. Again, mixed experiences with that, because one of the motivating group there was Red Action. You've never heard of them, but they were, well, there were probably some good people in it, but the leader in particular was a Napoleon type complex, and he used a lot of his members to act as like a football posse, even going to the extent of attacking some other, another anti-poll tax group who had the audacity to set up an anti-fascist group in their area,
Yeah.
And a lot of these things do have mixed reflections, but we did have some good conferences, and one of the people actually involved in Ibrox Cessnock, she went on to be a SNP government minister.
Oh wow!
Yeah, she was the only SNP in the group who actually had any time to work in a broad-based group.
Yeah.
We had Nicola Sturgeon, who lived at the top of Copeland Road at the time, on our list of members, and along with another one who went on to be an MP as well. But it was only Shona who went on to be a health minister and stuff in the government, who actually worked in a real constructive way with us.
Uh-huh.
So interesting experience again. So that all tailed off by the early 90s. A lot of these things overlapped as well, because you had things like City of Culture came along. So you had a different bunch of people who came out of the Free University movement, who came together as Workers' City. And they, first of all, contested the Garden Festival and all that stuff, and then went on to, it was just all to do with the remarketing of Glasgow at the moment. At that time, you had things like the Royal Concert Hall, which was called Lally's Pally. And it was just about asserting the workers against the bureaucrats and the interests of capitalism, and just being a thorn in their side. So you had writers like involved in Workers' City, especially James Kelman, but to some extent both through Free University, Alistair Gray and Tom Leonard and people like that as well. So through the Free University, there was a whole link to cultural things, and that in some ways more of an outgrowth from the Glasgow Bookshop Collective than it was from the anarchist scene. And so at the time too, again, just a slight digression, is that Edinburgh Review Press was edited by Peter Kravitz, who was actually founder of the Free University movement, and I wrote an article in that Edinburgh University called A Public Nuisance, The History of Glasgow Anarchism 1974 to 86, because that's when it was written. It was, that's I didn't cover anything beyond that, because that's basically, it was about 88 it was written. So there was a few other good articles in that one particular issue too, related to Edinburgh mostly. Yeah.
So what was that, the Free University Network?
Yeah, dynamic times in some respects, but there was always fraught with contradictions as well. I mean, I didn't take part in Workers' City because some of the characters were, had their own issues that I couldn't agree with, So ironically, I didn't take part in the Glasgow Keelie first time round. Mm-hmm. It's only in its latter reincarnation I've taken involvement. But I mean, I did, I would circulate it and things, and it was a great addition to what was going on. And it involved a different group of people too, which was good, because I had enough projects on the go, like Counter Information Here and Now, and the later stages of the Free Uni, and they're still holding down a 35-hour job a week. So, not easy to combine all these things.
Definitely not. Could you tell us a bit about the self-determination and power workshops?
Well, that was part of the Free University.
Okay.
And that was a big event. They had various events to do with the Free University. They also wanted to have a public building, and Peter Kravitz even went to the extent of golf caddying Sean Connery in order to try and get him to put money forward for but anyway, that didn't quite happen. But just had things scratch Parliament, and the biggest one was called Self-Determination, Power, Build and Govern. Noam Chomsky was invited, and various philosophers, George Davey and people like that at the time were, and even like legendary radical folk singer Roy Bailey came up at it as well, and it attracted I don't know what the attendance was, maybe 100 or so, and I was involved in the sorting out the workshops. People would indicate they wanted to hold a workshop, and there was like so many rooms in the Pearce Institute, and you had to work out where people would go, which workshops would like to be the most popular ones, so you didn't put them in a small room or thing. So some of that was filmed at the time, but even decades later, there's hardly anything that come out of it in terms of, sometimes there have been parts of it have been released via Facebook and things in recent years, but not a lot really. But James Kelman obviously had a big involvement in it, and Chomsky, of course, famously visited Brechin's Bar, which is had a comic thing through there. So actually, again, sometimes just talking means that you remember something it just slightly preceded that, and I'd be ashamed to miss it out, because in the late 80s, I think 87, was the very first meeting of Free University. There was a visit back to Glasgow of Jimmy Rayside and his wife Babs. Now, Jimmy Rayside would be involved in the Glasgow Anarchist Group in the 40s, and they were coming back to Scotland on a wee visit. You know, they now lived in Perth, Australia, and the main contacts for them were Charles and Molly Baird, who had been secretaries of the Anarchist Group in the 40s as well. But Charlie and Molly were great friends to various groups, you know, and Charlie was known in the 50s and 60s as the anarchist barber. He ran a barber shop in Garscraig Road briefly, and I think Molly was involved in that too. They were brilliant people, and so we thought, well, they're here, and John Taylor Caldwell's still around as well. So we persuaded all 5 of them to attend a meeting. Unfortunately, I was right in the top floor of a housing association in Lyndoch Street, just off Woodlands Road. There's an audio transcript of that meeting which I shared because I knew these people, so it had to be the link, even though it was Peter Kravitz and all these people were there from the Free Uni, and we just asked them questions. They tended to focus a bit on splits. Maybe that's just the way their memory went. But of course, the Raysides, like some other people, had gone off to work abroad after the Second World War because the revolution really hadn't happened. The Labour had been elected and started to recuperate all that back. But Charles and Molly and various people went on to form anarchist groups. And at the same time as the anarchist group, was a brief IWW group in Glasgow. The Anarcho-Syndicalist Direct Action Group did circulate this pamphlet. This is actually a 1945 edition of that pamphlet. Wow. Recently, when Charlie Baird's son, Charlie, retrieved piles of these from a loft when his parents had passed on. He used to live in Milton. Mm-hmm. So I still have some of them. So that was the Free University went on to have a lot of meetings, including these big ones I mentioned, the self-determination power and stuff. But initially that one's one of the few that has a proper. It's been, I think the cassettes were transformed into digital, and it's up on. I think it's up on the Anarchist Critic website or something. You'll probably find a link to that if you're once you edit things.
Yeah, that would be ideal.
I mean, I like a lot of interviews. I did a few interviews with cassette with John Taylor Caldwell, who had obviously been one of the right-hand persons for Guy Aldred, and he used to share a flat with Ethel MacDonald, in Gibson Street. The cassette, the cassettes are there and the digital things are there. I like them, except when I hear my own voice.
Yeah, I know what you mean. That's why I don't talk much in this. I just give you questions to let the others talk. Yeah, could you tell us a bit about the Anarchist Summer Schools in the early 90s?
Yeah, well, that's right. In the 90s, it's quite a large group of anarchists around there. And at that time, too, some of them were in national groups like Class War and Direct Action Movement, which preceded Solfed. Because I've not mentioned national organisations much, but at various points, some people were involved in the 70s. Like there was a thing called the Anarchist Workers Association. That was like a platformist group. So at various times, some people have been involved in national organisations. And again, it's a slight digression, but in the mid-80s, we were involved in Intercom, which was a network of people. It was mostly left communists, libertarian communists, council communists, and such like. Somehow the Glasgow Anarchists got involved in that, and we did host a conference of Intercom, which again we'd need a separate story about. But we did have a lot of links at that time with groups like Workers' Playtime magazine and stuff like that. Anyway, so come the 90s, there was people involved in these groups I mentioned, Class 4, etc. So we held 2 summer schools. One of the big instigators of the summer school was Bobby Lynn, because although he was on the periphery of things in terms of most group meetings and things, he was still he actually still produced his own news sheet around the Carlton area, Glasgow Cross area. And he was always wanting to hold a summer school. He also held an annual bus trip, which I never went on because I think they were quite drunken affairs.
Yeah.
Anyway, the summer schools were quite successful, brought a lot of people up from around England, including London. And at the time too, some of that group went on to produce the Scottish Anarchist magazine, which was like tried to bring, because we weren't working in a vacuum in Scotland. There were other groups in Edinburgh and such like as well. Some occasionally in Dundee, mostly in Aberdeen, they would have a group as well. I mean, the bookshop in Aberdeen, for example, lasted much longer than any other bookshops, Boomtown Books. Yeah, I mean, it's a guy who emerged then, Ian, let's just call him Ian, went on to be the editor of Black Flag, and he went on to write all sorts of books on Proton and Kropotkin, and also, I can't remember the actual title of these things. It's not Anarchist Reader. It's the thing where he gives all sorts of questions to answers, including economics. So, I mean, he's been probably the biggest theoretician to come out of Glasgow. He lives in East Midlands now, but he was meant to be a member of Solfed and whatever. But he's added a lot more to the sort of the literary output from Glasgow than anybody else. Plus editing Black Flag for many years, including a reincarnation this year. But I think it's all online. And he came from Postle Parker, isn't he? So there you go.
So could you tell us a bit about the Anarchist Circle?
Well, that was, so what happens is that there tends to be a bit of impetus for a couple of years. Like a lot of the anarchist group in the 90s, there was quite a big mobilization against anti-fascism, for example. I remember it was chasing fascists down the streets and stuff. But something, groups kind of lose impetus. There was a particular reason too, which I won't get into, in Glasgow as well. And it's just a rub of personalities. And some of them people would go back into these national groups more than local activity. The Anarchist Circle was just a smaller thing, but it's kind of legacy of that, to keep people in touch with each other. And that became the Workers' Circle, which was more interesting because we were actually focused on talking about, our workplaces and industries. And some people involved in that were shop stewards. But obviously they weren't, they came across shop stewards who were political, like Trots and things. But they found it difficult because they essentially, a lot of the members only wanted to fight about car parking spaces or get bailed out if they've done all sorts of transgressions and up for misdemeanor and disciplinary hearing and stuff. But anyway, we at some point, we started to become a bit more aware of the IWW. We had been exposed to IWW briefly through Dave Pattison. And I've actually just written an article which appeared in Wildcat, the IWW news sheet, which is kind of public now. Brief history of IWW in Scotland, part 1. And Dave Pattison had to be mentioned. I mentioned him before because he passed on when he was only in his 50s. He worked as an electrical engineer in the oil fields around the world. But he tried to promote the IWW. He didn't really have much success. I don't know. I think we just saw it as quite nostalgic, up to a point where things began to change, I think, around about the Tony Blair's government in 97 onwards, when there's just a slightly different form of capitalism getting produced. New kind of casualisation came in, and new jobs and things. And so a group of us got together and formed a Clydeside IWW branch. It wasn't really much to talk about in the first couple of years. We had a presence at some demos and things, but we didn't really have a focus on organisation. It was a very small IWW in the UK at the time. Was probably no more than a few hundred people, and we only had about 7 or 8. So that kind of went into abeyance. There was an unfortunate thing. I remember a young member died. So again, when some things like that happen to a group, they can set things back. Yeah. It is a personal blow. I mean, I didn't know the person that well, but it's a tragedy that somebody that young. So the group kind of recrystallized in the 2004 or 5, and a woman from Canada came over, and I started asking, well, where's the IWW branch? And Dave and I met Gwen, as she was then, and she knew a different generation of people who we didn't really know. So they joined, and it wasn't a huge group, but it was it was one of these. It was an era when you had to actually physically come along to a meeting to pay your dues. So like 2,000 membership would turn up every month, and sometimes if I missed one month, and they appointed me next month. So it was a completely different relationship. Whereas now you sign up online, and half the membership is completely unknown to the branch.
Yeah.
People join for all sorts of reasons. But anyway, so that changed obviously a bit over time. But the IWW branch has continued, Clydeside branch from about 2004 to present day. And we have like 280 members now, which is a big increase from what we were originally. We've had things we've done, like which are not carried on. I'd like to see likes of a publication like Strike Back, be not necessarily that name, but something similar done again. So some initiatives come and go, but I think obviously we're trying to focus on workplaces and industrial organising. It's not an easy task. We've had several workplaces in recent years where people have shown interest, and often the groups have got to be quite informal and under the surface, because it'd be quite easy to some of the management teams to just let people go. They don't have permanent contracts and things, and so it's almost like in the original days of trade unionism, quite underground in a sense. There's some positive developments, and it's been difficult, of course, too, with the pandemic, and that set things back a bit. Well, we were one of the first branches that really embraced contact via Zoom, and we also did phone banking, which involved phoning people up and stuff. Have the audacity to phone them up and are you, and what you're doing. So work to some extent. It's funny, I mean, some of these things are experiments, and so it's a long haul. I mean, I'm aware of too, then if you're in London, you might be more likely to be in the UBW, United Voices of the World. I think around Britain, some of these other syndicalist unions are growing as well. IWGB, the UBW, and London, and also the Allied Cleaners. So when you count all these syndicalist groups together, probably about 14,000 people involved. There'll be some overlap, but very little. I mean, I think IWGB staff members in London are all in the IWW, because you can't be in a same union if you're in dispute with it. So things like that. But there's differences too. I think the IWW is still slightly more anarchic and more slightly chaotic than the other ones.
Yeah.
You know, we don't have paid staff the way they have. We do have some paid admins, but not to the extent. And I've become a bit of a bureaucrat. I would have called myself a bureaucrat and known me, but I think, you know, some of these roles have to be done, and I think membership's a really important role. So, but these things are only for a couple of years. There's nothing. They're not, you know, roles that are continued on. So that's what I've been doing from the start of the pandemic. I stepped in somebody else's shoes, because I'd done it for a number of years, and you know, it's good in a way. I've engaged with a lot of people, attended some Zoom meetings in likes of Sheffield and stuff, and you know, it's been a pretty positive experience.
Did you manage to meet with the? Because I know I did this with the IWW, meet with the Zapatistas during COP26.
Yes, there was a small meeting, but again, the pandemic was a real obstacle. I think they could only find a really small cafe. I'm trying to remember what happened exactly. I didn't go, it was in Government Hill, and I think it was only allowed like 4 people from the branch, because once you included the entourage of the people from Chiapas, then there wasn't space. They weren't allowed to have M112 in the particular cafe. And it might have been filmed, I can't remember. We did contribute financially. That's one of the advantages of being a union branch, is that you accumulate funds and you can actually disperse funds. Whereas if you're just some affinity group, that's probably not going to be the case. You know? So we did that, and we've also dispersed some funds to only campaigns, of course, but likes of I've forgotten the name. I need to come up with because we're doing things recently about workers in Myanmar and workers in Bangladesh, and so we've worked with some people on that. These were during the pandemic, so again, not easy. We stand outside supermarkets and things, but we did try and keep the flame burning, which wasn't easy. Some branches more or less gave up the ghost, which I don't think it was a good idea.
So could you tell us a bit about the Spirit of Revolt Archive?
Yeah, well, that only came about 2011, I think. I think, you know, that was very much the creation of John, I don't even mind saying his name, John Cousin, who's a legend. He's a person who's been involved in politics since the apprentices strikes in the 50s. But, you know, I think he did various jobs and things, and he's always been a wee bit of an individualist, if you don't mind me saying, you know, just doing things without waiting for groups to organise it for him. So he did the Anarchist Critic, and then he realised, I mean, he's now 88 this year, John, you know, and way back in 2011, he realised that, you know, perhaps 10 years too late or so, because we have missed a lot of people. We need to accumulate archives from people and, you know, get their stories and gauge what they were collecting and into at the time, and form collections. And we were able to do that quite well again until the pandemic. You know? So we took the decision to, well, we only took the decision because the Mitchell embraced us to some extent. The archives department, I might have a wee break to have a cough for a bit.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, the best of times, my voice doesn't carry on forever. I've never been a public speaker, for example.
Yeah.
You know?
That's okay.
Public speaking actually was a thing that, when I mention public speaking, you actually think of the miners' strike. They used to have a public speaking platform on Argyle Street, and various people got up and did from the Anarchist Group, because we're collecting money for miners in Ayrshire. we just did that bilaterally. It was completely unapproved by the SDUC and things, but you know, we couldn't go through their channels. It just didn't work, you know. So we went down to Cumdock, or where it was. I can't even remember where it was, Open Lake or Cumdock or somewhere. I mean, it was an odd meeting. The miners were fantastic people, but they seemed to be like orange to the core.
Yeah.
So, and some of the anarchists, including Brian Biggins, thought it was a good idea to bring out a life leaflet called, which advocated Kalashnikovs for the miners. Which might seem a bit over the top, but I think it was just the idea that, you know, this is a strike which could escalate to more than that, because there was a lot of bad feeling, obviously, about Thatcher and what that government, that whole ethos was doing to industry and to the people's jobs and well-being, etc. throughout the whole of it. That's why the miners' strike was, people always wanted to generalise it. Anyway, you might be able to try and insert that bit somewhere, because clearly that should have been in the 80s.
That's right. No.
Involvement with the miners of South Ayrshire. Anyway, Spirit of Revolt, yeah, we missed the boat and a few people who sadly passed on. And, you know, if they'd known it was a Spirit of Revolt then, we could have maybe got some really great collections. Fortunately, people like Caldwell had put all this stuff into the you know, what was then Bailey's Library, and then went into, you know, the archive section. You know, we've had a look at that. We're not allowed to have it within Spirit of Revolt, but they've not digitised either. And hopefully, at some stage, if they can't digitise it, they'll pass it over to us. You know? I think the main value of Spirit of Revolt is stuff that appears online. I mean, it's good to preserve all these physical publications, you know, likes of I've mentioned, like, you know, Glasgow People's Press, or really obscure pamphlets like I was involved in, you know, all that stuff. It's great to have all that, you know, but, in the physical form, but really, you know, a lot more people are going to see it online. And we do that in conjunction with Sparrow's Nest in Nottingham, who are, and Tyneside Anarchist Collective as well. The three around the UK, I know they're doing it. They used to be Kate Sharpley Library, but I think they moved from England to Leicester or something to California. So I don't think they exist in the same form. So Spirit of Revolt is, so with accommodation in the Mitchell, one condition was we had to fund an archivist. That's not a major, you know, financial, because you can't fund somebody at a reduced rate. They've got to be paid the correct rate. But obviously, with an archive, you know, collective, we couldn't afford to pay them, you know, for anyone maybe 5 or 10 hours a week. You know, it's just not impossible. We've only ever had one grant. It was from a socialist organisation in London, who had actually, due to a spelling typo, it said Libertarian, Socialist instead of Libertarian Socialist. And so we got funds off them once, but never again. I think they were involved maybe with New Left magazine or something like that, some of them, yeah. Anyway, so funding's always just been done in-house, and people made quite substantial contributions to it. So that largely pays for the archivist. Our archivist, we've had a number of archivists, the original archivist who worked with us, actually really a Trotskyite, but we didn't know that at the time. But I mean, he was a really good person. I just mean that he didn't maybe understand all the political nuances. That, and the second one was gone into work for the Women's Library, and the present one works also for the Govanhill Baths. So
I was actually just speaking to Fatima from Govanhill Baths yesterday, the manager of the campaign there. She was talking about their archive that they've set up and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, Paul is our archivist, who's a common link with it. I mean, Fatima's politics are perhaps a bit different.
Yeah.
I mean,
She made that clear.
It's a bit thorny issue in Gumhill. Fortunately, I don't live in Gumhill. But the whole, I don't ever approve of all the ins and outs that's going on, but I think you've got to be involved in the community things, sometimes even with groups that are not of your choosing. But there you go, it's a difficult issue, because I know that a lot of the cafes and things around Gumhill are not necessarily in support of some of the things.
Yeah. So could you tell us a bit about
very confusing and complicated these days,
Yeah. Could you tell us a bit about the Glasgow Keelie?
Maybe just to finish off the Spirit of Revolt. So basically, we're hoping to obviously restart in the Mitchell. Basically, what happens in the Spirit of Revolt is that people would come in and do a bit of digitising. The actual cataloguing is done by the archivist. They have to work to a system that's compatible with the libraries. And once things are finished with, they're supposed to go into the library. Then that way it can be accessed by researchers and things. But as I say, our main emphasis is digitising anyway. Hopefully we'll get back in soon. Glasgow Keelie has come about much more recently again. It resurfaced 2019, I can't remember exactly. We did a May pilot issue, and then the next issue after that wasn't until 6 months after that. And then, of course, after a few months, we were into this whole pandemic thing. So we published about 5 issues, and then everything was online for a while. We only missed 1 month, which was April 2020, because we're still getting our act together then, find out we could meet by Zoom and stuff. Because otherwise, how are we going to organise anything? I mean, when you think back to the eras of, I mentioned the 70s, 80s, 90s, obviously there was no internet, there was no mobile phones. I mean, we did organise, despite all that, we had internal newsletters, phone trees and things, but it just shows you how things have changed, that we've become so reliant on technology. But that's just the way things are now, So yeah, Glasgow Keelie, the idea is to sort of have a news sheet that has some, strikes a chord with people in the street, and tries to combat all the the exposure they have to other media, it'd be television or the right-wing press, or all sorts of dialogues coming from all sorts of places, so that's the motivation behind it really is. And then it's certainly the publication that has been the most dynamic in terms of local impact. Certainly promoted at various organisations like Live and Rent, which is an organisation in Glasgow, which is hundreds of people joined up, and it's promoted IWW, it's promoted the 1820 Society, which we'd never probably dreamt of. I mean, we actually helped organise their commemorations, because their 200-year anniversary was in 2020. I did that in September 2020, and then again last year. And we've done obituaries too recently for one, the people like that who passed on, because there's a whole lot of history around Clydeside that deserves to be remembered. I mean, as I referred to in my article in Wildcat, the IWW news sheet, that we really base our history not back to the discovery of anarchism in the 1880s, but to the Carlton weavers and the Paisley weavers and people like that. They're the ones who really had the bravery to come out first, and also the people in the 1820 rebellion, come as it was straight after Peterloo. So yeah, all that history deserves to be resurrected. It's not taught in schools, and it's basically, it's part of our legacy. It's part of who we are. And there's that plaque outside the Weavers Cemetery in Carlton, saying that we need to remember them, but also emulate them. So that's really important.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, look, I think that Yeah, this has been an amazing conversation. I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to take up too much of your time when you've got a concert and so on to get to. But was
Well,
there
probably some lunch as well in between.
yeah, was there anything else you wanted to add in?
No, I mean, every time you do anything like, you'll probably remember millions of things that you could have mentioned. I don't know what you'll do with some of the digressions. That obviously I remember things that are out of sequence, but
That's fine.
But they're all kind of things that's just the way it happened, and I don't quite have the totally organised mind to go through every year. And I mean, some people sometimes wish that something like Tony Benn, he did his diary. If he had the, it's quite an egocentric thing to do, really. But actually, when you think about it, it would have been a valuable tool.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons I never did it because I just can't read my own handwriting.
Yeah, I'm the same. Mine's is scrawled. It's a scrawly mess. But yeah, thank you so much, Keith, for talking to me today.